title, the 170-meter steel rain, China's 272 million yuan mega crane catastrophe. Urgent, pulsing cable news visual, dramatic high-contrast satellite zoom into the dense urban grid of Shanghai. Shot cuts to dashcam footage of a massive lattice boom swinging uncontrollably above a crowded street, then cuts to black narrator. On the morning of February 5th, a man was walking to his office in the heart of Shanghai's bustling Huangpu district. He never made it. In a fraction of a second, 172 meters of high-tensile steel came screaming down across Wuhai Road, crushing a row of vehicles and killing him instantly where he stood. This was not a hidden defect inside a wall. It happened in broad daylight. The ground crew actually saw the structural failure coming, frantically waving pedestrians and delivery drivers back as the massive crawler crane began its fatal, unrecoverable arc. But what almost nobody understood on that freezing morning was that this multi-million-dollar machine had already been placed in a geometric configuration so unstable, it was engineered to fail. It would have toppled in barely any wind at all. Visual, graphic text overlay, not an act of God, not bad luck. This is not the story of a freak accident. It is a documented, reconstructible chain of catastrophic decisions that ended with a brilliant life cut short on a Shanghai sidewalk, a record-breaking 1.9 billion yuan settlement, and municipal authorities scrambling to completely rewrite the high-rise construction rulebook. And by the end of this breakdown, you will see why the structural engineers who investigated the wreckage never fully agreed on who was holding the smoking gun. Visual, far-sighted cuts of Chinese mega-projects, glistening glass towers, and then a massive crawler crane moving on heavy treads. To understand how a machine this massive falls out of the sky in one of the most heavily regulated Tier 1 cities on Earth, we have to look at the destination. The crane had been deployed on that specific block for less than a week. It went up at the end of January on a maintenance contract that, on paper, was about as routine as heavy lifting in a modern financial district gets. The site was the iconic East China Telecom Center. If you've ever lived in or conducted business across eastern China, your data has passed through this very block. From the street level, it's a hulking, monumental Art Deco tower that anchors an entire high-density commercial block wrapped by Wuhai Road, Shaanxi North Road, and local metro transit corridors. Originally built as a central telegraph and postal hub during the mid-20th century, today it has evolved into something far more critical, a massive Tier 4 carrier hotel. It is one of the densest hubs of internet and telecommunications traffic on the planet, with hundreds of global networks and data providers routing their fiber optic infrastructure directly through its reinforced concrete floors. Visual, 3D X-ray animation showing the interior of a data center, Certus glowing red, ventilation system iring. A digital fortress like that runs on astronomical amounts of power and continuous industrial cooling. In the high-stakes world of uptime infrastructure, components wear out. In late January, a specialized engineering crew arrived to swap out massive, multi-ton backup generators and industrial HVAC chilling units positioned on the skyscraper's roof to lift that extreme tonnage hundreds of meters into the air. Standard mobile cranes were completely out of the question. They needed a serious, heavy-duty industrial weapon. What they brought in was a massive heavy crawler crane, the type of mechanical leviathan that maneuvers on immense, tank-like steel treads instead of rubber tires. Fully rigged and assembled on Wuhai Road, it stood an astonishing 172 meters tall. It towered over the very telecommunications hub it was servicing, casting a massive shadow across the luxury residential compounds and high-end commercial spaces next door. Visual diagram showing the crane. Specifications. Haim boom versus luffing JB. The precise geometry of this machine is exactly where the disaster begins. The crane was configured with a main boom stretching 59 meters, but mounted directly to the tip of that main boom was a massive luffing jib that extended another 113 meters into sky. When you extend a luffing jib to those dimensions, it ceases to behave merely as a piece of lifting equipment. It becomes a giant metal sail. A jib that long catches the wind with immense force, which is precisely why the heavy machinery manufacturer provides strict, non-negotiable operational parameters regarding what to do the exact moment the weather turns. The crane was owned by a major domestic heavy equipment leasing group and operated under a specialized subcontract by a prominent municipal rigging firm. For the first few days of the operation, the lifts went off without a single hitch. The heavy generators were hoisted, the engineering metrics looked sound, and the project was moving on schedule. Then, the East China meteorological radar changed. By the afternoon of Thursday, February 4th, regional weather bureaus began issuing urgent alerts. A severe winter cold front was sweeping down into the Yangtze River Delta, promising rapid temperature drops, heavy sleet, and most importantly, sustained high-velocity wind gusts. This is the exact threshold where a routine urban engineering job quietly transforms into a fatal sequence of human choices. A crawler crane of this immense height, in this specific dual-boom configuration, is physically incapable of standing safely against high winds in an urban canyon. The manufacturer's technical manual and the Shanghai Municipal Housing and Urban-Rural Development Commission rules explicitly demanded the same thing. The crew must lower the luffing jib, lay the massive boom assembly down into a safe resting cradle, and secure the footprint before the high-velocity weather system arrives. Not when the wind starts blowing in the morning. Before, but as darkness fell over the Huangpi district on the night of February 4th, that mandatory safety protocol was completely ignored. The crane was left fully extended, standing completely vertical through the night, exposed to the teeth of an incoming storm that anyone with a smartphone could see coming. And as investigators would later discover, this wasn't the rigging firm's first brush with danger. The leasing company had already been flagged multiple times by local safety bureaus for site management violations over the previous 5 years. The machine stayed up, and by the time the ground crew scrambled to bring it down the next morning, the atmospheric physics had already caught up with them. Visual, dramatic outro slide with briefing graphics. Visual, simulated computer telemetry reconstruction. Red data strips flickering over a 3D CAD model of the crane set on Y Road. Narrator Friday, February 5th, opened with a biting cold heavy sleet and a rapidly stiffening wind channeled directly through the high-rise canyons of the commercial district. Sometime after 8 a.m., with local weather stations logging wind gusts pushing deep into the 20s in kilometers per hour, the site supervisor finally realized they were out of time. The order was given to the crane operator to begin lowering the massive 172-meter lattice structure into its designated street-level berth. On an ordinary day, lowering a dual-boom assembly of this scale is a slow, methodical, highly controlled engineering maneuver. It is designed to be completely boring. But as the operator began adjusting the winch lines, the ground crew noticed something terrifying. The massive luffing jib was dancing violently against the wind, catching gusts like a canvas sheet. Recognizing the immediate hazard, the crew on the ground did something that undoubtedly saved dozens of lives. They fanned out across the intersections of Wuhai Road and Shanxi North Road, screaming at pedestrians, delivery drivers, and morning commuters to back away from the footprint of the towering steel structure. Visual sound effect. The deafening, screeching rupture of high-tensile steel in tension at exactly 8:25 a.m. The laws of physics overrode the machinery. 172 meters of structural steel lattice lost its fight against gravity. The upper jib buckled, sending the entire 565-foot equivalent assembly crashing down across 2 full blocks of high-density urban real estate. The main boom slammed directly across Wuhai Road, caving in the roofs of an entire row of parked cars and tearing clean through the masonry and glass facade of a commercial annex. A massive 2-ton hook block, swinging with the momentum of a wrecking ball, punched directly through the roof of a nearby private institute, forcing an immediate, panicked evacuation of hundreds of students beneath the asphalt. A primary municipal water main ruptured under the kinetic impact, sending torrents of water flooding into the street, while underground gas lines were severely compromised. The entire base of the crawler crane, loaded with dozens of tons of heavy solid counterweights, flipped a full 180 degrees into the air. The only reason the entire machine didn't bounce into a high-density residential high-rise was that the heavy tracks somehow caught the edge of the reinforced timber cribbing beneath them. Visual, drifting smoke, flashing emergency lights. Chinese fire rescue trucks arriving en masse. More than 140 municipal fire rescue personnel and emergency vehicles rushed to seal off the disaster zone. A construction worker inside an adjacent office tower captured the entire collapse on his smartphone. A harrowing, unedited sequence showing the skyscraper-sized lattice boom snapping like a toothpick. But amidst the tangled mass of steel on the sidewalk lay the true tragedy of the morning. A 38-year-old financial professional named Shanghai was simply walking to his office when the sky fell. He had no warning. He died instantly under the impact. 3 other pedestrians were severely injured, including a middle-aged woman who required dozens of staples to close a severe head wound from flying concrete debris, and an elderly man crushed inside his vehicle. Zhang Wei was an extraordinary mind. Born in a rural township in Anhui province, he had overcome intense socio-economic hurdles to secure a prestigious mathematics degree from a top-tier university in Beijing, eventually spending 15 years as a senior quantitative analyst for a major Shanghai investment firm. His colleagues didn't describe him as a ruthless trader. They knew him as an incredibly humble man who quietly funded educational scholarships for impoverished children in his home village. Now, he was gone, the victim of an engineered catastrophe visual. Kyle zoom in on an onboard, black box computer spillet screened with reconstructed wind vectors. So how does a top-tier industrial crane, operated by a fully certified specialist in a city with some of the strictest construction codes in the world, end up laying flat across 2 city blocks? The definitive answer was buried inside the machine's black box, like all modern mega-lifting equipment deployed in China's Tier 1 cities. This crawler crane carried an advanced onboard computer that logged operational telemetries hundreds of times every single second. It recorded boom ells, jib angles, hydraulic pressures, error codes, and electronic limit switch positions. Following the collapse, investigators from the local housing bureau, the Municipal Construction Commission, and the China Academy of Building Research seized the data logs to reconstruct the machine's final seconds down to a single millimeter of structural deflection to clear the street. Specialized salvage crews used heavy blowtorches to slice the collapsed lattice boom into 35 separate segments just to haul it away for forensic analysis. Investigators checked every single mechanical suspect: metal fatigue in the joints, failed structural pins, fractured welds, or unevenly distributed counterweights. They found absolutely nothing. The steel was structurally immaculate. The factory fabrication was perfect. Instead, the data revealed a chilling detail that almost everyone outside the forensic team completely missed. At the exact millisecond the crane lost structural equilibrium, the main boom was sitting at an angle of roughly 73 degrees, while the long luffing jib was positioned at approximately 51 degrees. In that specific geometric layout, the engineers calculated that a wind blowing from behind the machine at a velocity of just 42 kilometers per hour would be enough to generate an aerodynamic force exceeding the crane's entire tipping resistance. But then, the structural forensic team ran the algorithms again. This time, they factored in the natural elastic stretch of the crane's high tensile steel cables, the minor deflection of the support bars, and the exact weight distribution of the hooks at those specific angles. What? The computer spat out left the entire investigative panel stunned, in the exact physical position the crane was in during those final moments. It didn't need a storm to fall over. The engineers calculated that it could have been flipped entirely out of equilibrium by a wind velocity of just 6.4 kilometers per hour. 6 kilometers per hour. That is literally the speed of a casual pedestrian strolling down Wuhai Road. In plain engineering terms, by the time the operator attempted to lower the machine on Friday morning, the crane was barely holding itself upright by its own weight. There was no payload on the line. There was no snapped component or manufacturing defect. The machine did exactly what the immutable laws of physics and structural mechanics dictated it would do, once it was forced into that fatal geometric trap. And that trap was sprung entirely by a human decision made 12 hours prior. Both the Municipal Safety Bureau and the National Workplace Safety Administration landed on the exact same conclusion independently. The chief operator had completely failed to properly lower and secure the dual boom configuration on the evening of February 4th, ahead of a major, publicly forecasted wind event, and then proceeded to lower the system at an unapproved, highly volatile angle the following morning into the teeth of a gale. Local authorities were unyielding in their assessment. It was an act of extreme operational negligence. If the story ended with one operator making one bad call, it would be a tragic but isolated incident. But as the municipal investigation deepened, the finger-pointing turned inward, exposing a massive, systemic blind spot within the regulatory machinery of the city itself. Visual map of China flashing red markers across major urban hubs, Shenzhen, Chongqing, Guangzhou, Tianjin, illustrating a nationwide landscape of ultra-dense high-rise construction narrator. To fully comprehend the sheer terror of what happened on Wuhai Road, you have to realize that this crane did not collapse in a vacuum. It fell in a country that contains more than half of the world's skyscrapers. A nation that has spent the last 3 decades rewriting the limits of civil engineering, structural density, and rapid build cycles. When a 172-meter steel tower topples onto a Tier 1 Chinese metropolis, it sends shockwaves through every municipal construction commission from Harbin to Shenzhen. Why? Because across China's urban centers, thousands of these identical mega cranes are hovering over schools, mass transit networks, and high-density residential blocks every single day. The catastrophic failure in Shanghai immediately forced structural forensic experts to draw chilling parallels to other high-rise structural crises that have shaken the country's construction sector, disasters where the margin between routine operation and total devastation was shaved down to a few millimeters. Visual, archival images, architectural renderings of the segregated fault lines and settlement disasters in urban hubs. Consider what happened during the infamous structural emergency at the 300-meter-tall Seg Plaza in Shenzhen. In broad daylight, a luxury skyscraper filled with thousands of electronics traders suddenly began to vibrate violently, oscillating on its foundations without a single tremor of seismic activity. For days, national structural engineers and panels from the China Academy of Building Research scrambled to diagnose the phantom movement. The culprit? A combination of rooftop mast resonance, wind-induced vortex shedding, and minor structural variations that created a terrifying harmonic frequency. The building had to be sealed shut, its massive rooftop spires completely stripped away before occupancy bans could be lifted. It proved that, in the realm of supertall engineering, top-heavy structures are hypersensitive to atmospheric dynamics, and the risks multiply exponentially when you look at the sheer volume of concrete and soil settlement issues plaguing rapid development zones. In the dense river mud foundations of coastal hubs like Tianjin and Guangzhou, massive towers have faced severe structural tilting due to asymmetrical soil settlement. Who can forget the infamous residential block collapse in Shanghai's own Minhang district, where an entire 13-story high-rise simply tipped over intact onto its side? The engineering analysis revealed that unbalanced soil excavation on one side, combined with the weight of piled earth on the other, created a lateral pressure differential that sheared the building's hollow concrete foundation piles right at the base. Visual 3D breakdown comparing crane. Toppling mechanics to high-rise. Structural leanings. These historical precedents matter because they reveal a cultural and systemic pattern. In the race to achieve rapid build cycles and maximize urban density, the structural margins for heavy lifting equipment on the ground are often squeezed just as tightly as the engineering tolerances of the skyscrapers themselves. When the Wuhai Road crane failed, the technical community immediately realized this wasn't an isolated mechanical glitch. It was a symptom of a much broader structural hazard. Heavy crawler cranes are mobile structures, while a permanent skyscraper is anchored deep into bedrock using hundreds of reinforced concrete friction piles. A 172-meter crawler crane relies entirely on its massive counterweights, the strength of its lattice geometry, and temporary timber cribbing laid directly on top of public roads. The structural core, a crane in this configuration, possesses a center of gravity that shifts dynamically with every single degree of boom movement. If the main boom or luffing jib is held at an improper angle during high wind gusts, the wind load transforms the entire lattice structure into a massive lever, multiplying the overturning moment until it completely overpowers the dead weight of the chassis counterweights. When investigators contrasted the Shanghai accident with global mega project failures, they noted a critical difference. In many international crane disasters, the root cause is a sudden mechanical snap. A hook shears, a hoisting cable frays under load, or a hydraulic cylinder explodes. But in the Wuhai Road catastrophe, the structural forensic data proved the crane was operating under zero payload. The hook block was empty. This placed the disaster in a much more alarming category: static geometric instability induced by poor risk management. It shared an identical DNA with the fatal high-rise structural failures that occur when contractors alter building loads mid-construction without recalculating the foundational bearing capacity. Visual. Close-up, scrolling through complex blueprints and government safety mandates. The China Academy of Building Research noted that as towers grow taller and urban canyons become tighter, the microclimates within cities become incredibly hostile. A 30-kilometer-per-hour wind at street level can easily double or triple in velocity when channeled through a narrow gap between two glass curtain wall skyscrapers, a phenomenon known as the Venturi effect. The rigging crew on Wuhai Road had set up their heavy machinery inside a literal wind tunnel formed by the East China Telecom Center and its surrounding high-rises. Yet, the on-site risks assessments treated the job as if it were taking place in an open, flat field. The investigation exposed a terrifying reality. Across the country's booming construction landscapes, the rapid deployment of massive lifting systems had outpaced the local housing bureau's ability to monitor real-time microclimate risks. The structural physics were clear. The historical warning signs from previous high-rise failures were documented, but the institutional safeguards were completely missing in action. The stage was set for a massive legal and bureaucratic war over who would bear the ultimate financial and criminal steel rain, for the steel rain that paralyzed the financial heart of Shanghai. Visual dramatic satellite image timeline showing Wuhai Road before and after the collapse, highlighting the impact zone with red overlays across two city blocks. Narrator. When 172 meters of high-tensile structural steel slams into a high-density metropolitan corridor, the immediate financial, physical, and emotional debris takes years to clear. The kinetic force of the impact was so massive that it registered on regional microseismic sensors across the Huangpi district. Let's us look at the raw, unvarnished math of the destruction left behind on that freezing morning. The main lattice boom and the extended luffing jib didn't just fall into an empty street. They blanketed two entire city blocks of prime Shanghai commercial and residential property. Over a dozen parked vehicles were flattened instantly, reduced to scrap metal beneath the weight of the steel tubes. The 2-ton hook block, traveling at terminal velocity from hundreds of meters in the air, ripped through the concrete roof of the nearby regional institute, punching through multiple floors like a bullet through cardboard. Had the incident occurred just 1 hour later, those classrooms would have been packed with hundreds of students. The institute was forced into an immediate emergency evacuation, shutting down its entire campus operations and canceling all specialized academic and professional certification tracks for days. Visual. Diagram showing the complex underground infrastructure networks beneath Wuhai Road, but the visible damage above ground was only half the nightmare. The sheer weight of the impact crushed the subterranean utility networks beneath the asphalt. A critical 600-millimeter high-pressure municipal water main ruptured instantly under the shockwave, turning Wuhai Road into a rushing river within minutes and draining millions of liters of treated water from the local grid. Concurrently, secondary underground gas distribution lines were severely fractured, releasing highly volatile fumes into the surrounding urban canyons. Municipal emergency services had to rapidly cut off power and gas grids across a multi-block radius, completely disabling operations at adjacent retail centers, high-end corporate offices, and luxury residential complexes. Hundreds of families were ordered to evacuate their homes immediately. pouring onto the cold streets in a state of utter panic as emergency crews hunted for potential exit sources amidst the wreckage. Visual profile channels with graphics outlining the lives impacted by the structural fleet, and yet all of the property damage, the broken concrete, and the ruptured infrastructure paled in comparison to the human cost on the sidewalk. As we mentioned, Zhang Wei, the brilliant 38-year-old quantitative analyst, lost his life instantly. He was simply taking his usual pedestrian route from the local metro station to his trading desk when the lattice structure sheared out of the sky. The details of his final moments paint a picture of extraordinary, quiet cruelty. Zhang Wei was a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to the precise study of mathematical probabilities and structural risk management in financial markets. He knew how to calculate the most minute anomalies in complex systems. But no mathematical model could have predicted that a multi-million-dollar construction project next door would disregard basic physics so thoroughly that a light breeze would turn a crane into a deadly weapon. At his memorial service in Shanghai, his widow was completely inconsolable. Her grief was echoed by Zhang Wei's elderly parents, who had traveled from their rural township in Anhui province to face the reality that the son who had lifted their entire family out of poverty through sheer intellectual brilliance had been taken away by a completely avoidable engineering failure. Municipal mayor, visiting the active disaster zone over the weekend as crews worked around the clock to clear the steel, told regional media outlets that it was an absolute miracle that the death toll wasn't in the dozens. While technically true, that statement provided zero comfort to a family that had just lost everything. Beyond the fatality, the physical toll rippled across other ordinary citizens. A 45-year-old female logistics clerk, caught in the open street during her morning commute, was struck by a chunk of supersonic concrete debris thrown off by the impact. She was rushed to the nearest trauma unit, requiring dozens of surgical staples to close a massive gash across her skull, along with long-term rehabilitation for severe neurological trauma. A 73-year-old retired municipal worker was trapped inside his crushed sedan on Shanxi North Road, suffering severe crush injuries to his lower limbs as fire rescue personnel used hydraulic jaws to cut him from the flattened frame. Even the emergency responders weren't spared. A veteran fire rescue specialist was severely injured during the initial chaotic hours of the recovery operation when an unstable section of the snapped lattice boom shifted unexpectedly, pinning him against a rescue vehicle. Visual reconstruction of a courtroom with split screen showing official documents and revenue charts. Legal and financial fallout from this catastrophic morning would ultimately trigger the largest corporate and municipal payout in the history of China's construction industry. The initial civil litigation filed by Zhang Wei's family, combined with the collective claims of the injured pedestrians, small business owners, and property management groups, sought an astronomical 4.2 billion yuan in punitive and compensatory damages. They didn't just target a single entity. The legal strategy systematically named every single link in the operational chain: the state-tied developers who ordered the generator replacement, the property management group of the East China Telecom Center, the specialized rigging firm that executed the lift, the heavy equipment leasing conglomerate that owned the crawler crane, and even the Municipal Construction Commission itself for failing to enforce seasonal safety. Following a grueling, highly public series of legal proceedings and independent structural arbitrations in Shanghai, the litigation culminated in a historic, record-breaking total settlement of 1.9 billion yuan, equivalent to roughly $272.5 million US dollars. To this day, it stands as an unprecedented financial landmark, representing one of the largest construction-related accident settlements on the planet. More than $250 million in financial liabilities, all tracing directly back to a single dual-boom assembly lowered at a volatile, illegal geometric angle on a snowy morning when the entire machine should have been resting safely on the ground. The compliance breakdown: when municipal investigators began auditing the internal communications of the rigging firm, they uncovered a dark repository of text messages and logistical logs from the night of February 4th. The project managers were actively tracking the incoming winter storm, yet they openly chose to delay stowing the crane to avoid paying overtime to the late-night ground crew and to prevent a 12-hour freeze on the lucrative high-rise maintenance contract. The criminal and professional consequences for the chief opera, Tor, Kevin Riley, known locally by his professional registry name, Ren Lei, were swift and unforgiving. Following a comprehensive administrative and safety trial spearheaded by the local housing bureau, Ren Lei's elite class, commercial crane operator credentials were permanently revoked. He was hit with massive personal fines totaling hundreds of thousands of yuan and faced potential criminal prosecution for causing a major public safety disaster through professional negligence. Throughout the hearings, Ren Lei fought back bitterly, claiming that he was merely following the confusing, contradictory directives of the on-site lift director, and that the onboard computer telemetry didn't account for sudden, freak aerodynamic vortexes created by the surrounding skyscrapers. But the independent engineering panel stood firm. The physical formulas did not lie. Had Ren Lei simply followed the mandatory manufacturer guidelines and laid the 172-meter lattice boom down into its secure horizontal cradle, on the night of February 4th, the aerodynamic forces would have been completely neutralized. Wuhai Road would have remained safe, the infrastructure would have remained intact, and Zhang Wei would have finished his morning walk to his office. Yet, as the final regulatory reports were printed, an even deeper, more disturbing question emerged from the wreckage. A senior administrative judge, reviewing the engineering blueprints, discovered that the fault lines ran much higher than just a single negligent operator sitting inside a control cab. Visual, weather stations, and real-time, wind monitoring interface flashing across high-rise construction. Sites in Shanghai narrator. If this catastrophic failure could be entirely blamed on one operator making one bad call inside a control cab, the structural engineering community might have slept a little easier. But it didn't. The administrative judge, who finalized the official investigation into the Wuhai Road collapse, looked far beyond the man pulling the levers in a scathing, highly detailed regulatory report. The investigative panel dropped a bombshell that shook the Municipal Housing Bureau to its very foundations. The judge discovered that the specialized safety plan for how this 172-meter Leviathan was supposed to be stowed and secured overnight. A plan drafted months in advance by the project's engineering consultants and rigging firm was a physical impossibility. The document laid out a method for lowering and securing the dual-boom lattice assembly that quite simply could not be executed within the tight, narrow physical constraints of Wuhai Road without striking adjacent buildings. Yet, the Municipal Construction Commission had reviewed this flawed engineering plan, overlooked the geometric conflict, and stamped it approved anyway. Think about the sheer institutional failure of that for a second. The official narrative put out by the developers was that this was a simple case of operator error, full stop. And there was genuine, undeniable truth in that. The operator should have never attempted to lower the boom into a gale on Friday morning. But a high-level judicial inquiry looking at the exact same data concluded that the safety plan the operator supposedly ignored was a plan the city itself had blessed, despite the fact that it could not actually be followed in the real world. Visual, graphic timeline showing sweeping, regular overhauls across the metropolis. The Municipal Housing Bureau rejected those structural findings in the strongest possible terms, desperately standing by individual operator negligence as the sole proximate cause. The institutional disagreement was never truly settled, but the sheer terror of having 172 meters of high-tensile steel fall out of the sky forced an immediate, massive transformation across the entire industry. Shanghai had already lived through structural scares before. From tilting towers on muddy riverbeds to sudden fire emergencies in rapid-build high-rises, the city had promised deep structural reforms then, too. But when the steel rain paralyzed the Huangpi district, the response from the municipal government was instantaneous, sweeping, and ruthless. Within mere hours of Zhang Wei's death, emergency orders were flashed to every single construction site across the city's vast jurisdiction. municipal authorities ordered every single crawler crane and tower crane operating within the metropolitan grid to be locked down and secured immediately. In a single afternoon, 376 massive crawler cranes and more than 50 super-tall tower cranes were frozen in place across the city. As safety inspectors flooded the streets, the Municipal Commission stood up a dedicated, elite crane safety working group composed of top structural minds from the China Academy of Building Research. Over the following months, they completely rewrote the regulations governing urban heavy lifting, the exact type of dual-boom crane configuration involved in the Wuhai Road disaster, the kind that requires an operator to stop work and initiate complex lowering procedures in wind speeds of 20 kilometers per hour or less, was banned from high-density city streets permanently. The risk of human error during an unexpected storm was simply too high. Furthermore, the new mandates decreed that every single crawler crane operating in a Tier 1 city must be outfitted with advanced, automated anemometers, digital instruments that measure real-time wind velocities at the very tip of the boom and stream that data directly to a centralized municipal monitoring network. No more guessing about the weather. No more relying on an operator checking their phone. Every major high-rise engineering project was now legally required to employ a designated, certified lift director on site. This individual's sole legal responsibility is to monitor real-time microclimate metrics, track regional meteorological radars, and order a preventative site shut down hours before a cold front ever hits the city grid. The Municipal Commission also enacted a strict 25-year operational age limit on any heavy lifting equipment permitted to work near public streets, while simultaneously doubling the criminal and financial penalties for firms failing to secure their footprints overnight. Visual, high-speed time-lapse of the modern, unit-accorded Shanghai skyline, focusing on the East China Telecom Center. Not everyone in the sector cheered the new draconian enforcement. Several massive construction and state-backed development consortiums quietly attempted to lobby against the regulations, arguing that no other infrastructure market in the world treated moderate wind velocities as a reason to completely freeze multi-billion yuan projects. They argued it would cripplingly slow down rapid build cycles. The municipal government refused to back down an inch. The risk was simply too catastrophic. It is worth sitting with the profound, quiet cruelty of how completely avoidable this entire engineering disaster truly was. The winter storm forecast was public information for days. The manufacturer's technical boundaries were written in plain text. The municipal guidelines were clear. The heavy crawler crane should have been resting safely in a horizontal cradle on Thursday night. Instead, a multi-million-dollar machine was left standing through a winter gale, forcing a desperate ground crew to try and wrestle a 172-meter tower to the ground in the exact atmospheric conditions it was physically never built to survive. Zhang Wei had left his small village in Anhui province as a teenager with nothing but an exceptional mind, building a life of such intellectual and personal impact in Shanghai that those around him openly used words like brilliant and extraordinarily generous without a second thought. He was 38 years old. He was simply walking to his office, and the forensic data proves he was killed by a machine that had been put in a geometric configuration so volatile. It was just one soft pedestrian breeze away from coming down, no matter who was standing beneath it. The operator's career is permanently finished. The rigging company paid a record-breaking price. The city radically hardened its building codes, and yet, the historic Art Deco tower that the crane was servicing still stands proudly on its block in the Wangpi district, completely unbothered, quietly routing millions of terabytes of internet data across the planet every single second, as if the steel rain had never happened. Outro music fads in with an urgent, continuous beat if you want to understand the hidden structural risks, the engineering failures, and the institutional blind spots behind the high-density mega-projects that shape our world, the stories that dominate a single local news cycle and then completely vanish beneath the noise. Make sure to hit subscribe. There is always another disaster waiting to be reconstructed. See you next week.